Hi, I'm James with Rocketry Works. Today I'm going to show you how to assemble one of Rocketry Works custom fit high power rocket transition sections. These are ABS plastic 3D printed transitions that are custom fit to your large end and small end and transition length specifications. And because this is in a high power rocket application, we recommend using a stiffener tube. This is a high power, thick wall tube that's going to be held in place with laser cut centering rings and bulkheads custom designed for this particular transition. We're going to do a dry fit on this assembly. That is, we're not going to be using epoxy, but for your assembly at home, I recommend going through this dry fit process so that you understand how it all fits together and how you can make sure to get these inside centering rings exactly where you want them. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a minute. For tools for this dry fit, I'm just using a pair of clear plastic rulers. You can use dowels or screwdrivers or something. We're going to need to be pushing a centering ring down inside that tube so that it's secure in the place it needs to be. So let's go through the dry fit. First thing we're going to do is we're going to assemble the three parts of the transition. They come off the printer in three sections like this. It produces better margins for you and ensures that we can print larger parts with the limited height of the bed. So I happen to know that this large end of the transition is a pretty tight fit into the transition section. That is the shoulder is. But all you need to do is basically just leave your shoulder on the table and align it as best you can. There's a little angle to it, and then push down. And that's it. So this, and it's actually really convenient to have one this tight because it's going to hold together while you're working on the dry fit. In production, when you're ready to glue this, you're going to need to epoxy that little coupler between the shoulder and the transition. Again, we're going to fully assemble the transition sections. When you're in production, you're going to glue both these parts in place. And this looks pretty good, it feels good, but for high power rocketry, we want it a little stronger. So what we're going to do first is start with one of these small centering rings. All of these centering rings have an engraved side, and that engraving is your indication that that's the side that you should insert the tube from. And the reason is there's always a bevel to the laser that comes from the top, the same side that we engrave on, and so it's just easier to slide the tube on using that bevel. I go ahead and take this tube and slide it into the small end of the transition assembly. And you're going to feel it resting against a little coupler that's inside the tube. There's a little platform in there that's holding that centering ring. Now's the time to epoxy, when it's time to epoxy. But right now we're just dry fitting. So you want to slide this down so that it's still sticking out a little ways from the top. Take your second centering ring. Leave it flush with the top of the tube. This tube is custom fit to be just the right length for your transition. And finally take the bulkhead and rest that on top. It's really being used right now as a spacer. You want to pick up the whole assembly, flip it over on the table, realign your bulkhead and centering ring there, and now you're just pushing down. So what's happening is this centering ring that's sitting right here is staying in place, resting against that inside coupler. You're sliding this down so it's in exactly the right place. When it's time to epoxy, you epoxy at each of those steps. You want all that epoxy in place to glue it in. Let's assume that the small end of your transition is facing your airframe with the ejection charges down there. You're going to want this fully glued in place. That end should always stay in place. It's possible to leave this end removable so that you can work with electronics that you may be using on that inside tube. So now that your inside tube is correctly positioned just a little bit below the top of the large end coupler, take your first centering ring from the large end coupler, or from the large end, slide it on there. You may be able to fit your fat fingers in there. I can't really get mine in there easily, so I use something to just push down both sides at once. Now it is now resting on the coupler on the large end, and it's exactly in the place it wants to be. If you were to pick this up now, you can feel that inside tube is not sliding around as long as it's glued. So again, if you're gluing right now, think about every step where you're about to close something off, but you should be gluing your first large end centering ring in place now. Once that's set up and it's the way you like it, take your second large end centering ring, align it and glue it flush with the front of the inside tube, And then finally, this is the part, all that should be glued when it comes down to it. And you'll see that you have just about exactly a 1/4 inch right around the top inside the coupler. For dry fitting purposes, we can put that bulkhead plate on there. And I see that both, my whole thing is assembled. I've got bulkhead on both ends exposed there. If you are gluing, I would, and trying to use your inside tube as an avionics bay, I'd recommend leaving the big end bulkhead or the forward end bulkhead off, so that the way you can assemble this is never glue this in place. Leave it here as your access panel and run a piece of all thread all the way through here, from small end to front end. Leave it just a little ways out and use coupler nuts to secure that with a washer on either end. That's going to secure your whole bit in place. Typically, let's say the small end here is facing your airframe with your ejection charge. I would use a coupling nut there to secure that end of the all thread, and then put a 1/4 20 eye bolt onto the other end of the coupling nut, and that's going to allow you to attach your shock cord there. On the front end, I might use a wing nut here with a washer to secure the front end so that you can easily disconnect this, pop it off, and access your electronics in there. So that's the dry fit process. These do take a little bit of thought about how you want to customize it for use of avionics, or if you really are brave, I would really use all thread in all these cases, but you could in theory glue it all well together and have just a 1/4 20 eye bolt on the end here. But my concern there is you're then putting that epoxy under tension rather than pulling the whole thing together with a piece of all thread through the middle. So the recommended assembly is to use all thread all the way through the middle, and you can go from there.